Imagine your infrastructure codebase has evolved from a few files to thousands of lines across dozens of configuration file, and your team spends hours deciphering CloudFormation templates. Your AWS CDK deployments take 30 plus minutes, and introducing any change becomes just a huge multi-day effort. This is a reality that many organizations face when their infrastructure's code approach starts to outgrow their tooling. So today I have Daniel Ward. He's a consultant and developer who helps organizations improve their software delivery process, among other things. But through his work, he's seen how the right technologies, and specifically in his case, using C#, using an actual programming language, can transform the way development teams accomplish things, instead of forcing everybody to use declarative configuration files. So Dan, great to have you here.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, your background as a consultant, what you do?
So my background in general is as a developer. I started out at a .NET shop, never really stopped doing .NET. So I'm a MVP now, first year. So that was cool.
Congrats, by the way.
Yeah, thanks. I don't do just .NET. I do some TypeScript and kind of whatever the teams that I'm working with need, I guess. About almost 6 years ago, I also got into consulting. So they call it coaching there. So the idea is, we don't just write stuff for you or tell you stuff, then leave. We kind of the goal should be like, once we leave, they don't need us anymore. Put ourselves out of a job. So that's how I think of coaching.
And what type of problems do organizations bring you in for? What problems are you helping them solve?
Yeah, the initial reason that companies come is always different, right? It's usually like some big thing happened, we lost money, and we know we need automated tests now, but we don't know how to do that. So we help them with that. But then doing that, we figure out any of these, you figure out a bunch of stuff along the way. Also should be fixed, right? It should be improved. And if you do a good job, then they're also like, that went so well, I also want you to help me with this thing. Or it could be like, we really want to get off mainframe, but we've never used the cloud before. Can you help us with that? Sometimes it's product stuff, right? I do some of that too. It's like, we can't deliver. Our sprints are a month. We don't know what's going on, right? And kind of brought up cloud, like pipelines and infrastructure as code is a big part of that, right? Choosing your tech stack for that. So just I guess modern software engineering practices is what I help with.
So bringing people up,
kind of broad.
Yeah. But it's like bringing places up to a modern standard, right? Like you're bringing the best practices.
Yeah. Their tagline where I work at Lean Techniques, their tagline is so you can turn your IT into from a cost center to a competitive advantage.
Nice. Well, that's a good thing to do. You mentioned when we talked earlier about this, I guess it was like a rule you had for organizational change about only introducing 10% or something. Like, could you explain that?
Yeah. This is a really good one, in my opinion. So this comes from a book called The Secrets of Consulting by Gerald Weinberg, which I think came out in the 80s. But he's got a bunch of rules and laws that he names in it. And this is most of the book. But one of them is the 10% rule. And I think it's just one of the ones that stuck with me the most for whatever reason, or I thought had the most impact. But essentially, when you go into a new team, a client, whatever, don't try to change more than 10%, or don't try to improve more than 10% at a time. And there's a few reasons. One of them is you can actually end up making the client look bad, because if you just try to improve all this stuff at once, you could end up they hired you to make them look good, right? Or to cover themselves, and you could make it look like their boss comes down and says, how come this guy was able to fix all this in 6 months and you've been on it for 5 years and you can't fix it? So you probably won't get hired again after that, right? But also any social group, programming, or outside of work, if you come in and you're new and you try to change how the group works before you familiarize yourself with it, anyone's going to be resistant to that, right? It's like, who do you think you are? You just got here. You don't even understand our stuff yet. And they're right. Like, you could be wrong about some of it. You have to understand how they work a little bit to understand what the problems are. Um, and it's not just like about money, like getting hired again. It's about, they hire you again because you did a good job and because they like you. I don't know if this is also from the book or from something else, but if you've ever heard, no matter what kind of problem you think it is, it's always a people problem. that that also kind of gets to the heart of it, I think.
Nice. So like if let's say I'm at a new place, and let's stick with infrastructure as code. So they don't have a approach to infrastructure as code, or it's kind of hit or miss. I'm a big fan of Palumi, obviously, and I want to introduce it. So what does that advice tell me? That like I should pick a small project, or help me make this change.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. If a place is completely new to a thing and they're looking to me for guidance, I'm going to tell them to start small because like none of your engineers know how to do this thing, and I'm not going to do all this work for you and then leave because then none of your engineers are going to know how it works to maintain it, right? Um, and that's exactly what I suggest. Usually, when people are moving off a mainframe, they want like some kind of strangler pattern or something. So like choose something small, move it, uh, write infrastructure as code for that, move it over and see if it works, and then bite off a little something bigger each time or spread it around to more teams once you know that works. But yeah, I think that's nail on the head. That's exactly what I would recommend.
And like what if I didn't do that? Like what would go wrong if I was just like, hey, over the weekend I redid everything and now it's in C sharp and Palumi. And you mentioned people, like if I make a big change, even if it works um, technologically, like would I face resistance or pushback? I don't know.
So yes, and it depends. I've been on teams where I'm like, oh my gosh, they're awesome. They're like not really resisting anything, and they're open to improving. So maybe in those cases, they're coming from a really bad background and they want stuff improved already. I don't know. And then I've been on teams where were probably what you would more expect, where they're like resistant to most stuff, and it's like you know, my manager told me I had to work with you, that kind of stuff. So it's always easier if you can do pull based versus push based. Like the team has asked for your help instead of the manager telling them, I'm inflicting his help on you. That's what we say. But I would also say it goes back to not changing too much too quick. Like you're still learning as the new person how they work and you're trying to improve stuff. So like you might be trying to change something that they actually need because you're not familiar with their system. Like you really want them to own the work as a consultant. So like even if you think you know like the correct path and you're correct about it, you want them to kind of find out that correct path for themselves, I guess. Because like them convincing themselves is correct is the only way they're going to stick with it once you leave.
Hmm. So like, I would love this advice to be useful for people who aren't even consultants, right? They just want to like get some change done at their organization. Yeah, so I'm curious about that, like putting it in that wider context. Like, how do I overcome resistance? How do I get the other people on my team, if I'm new, to be excited about infrastructure as code or Palumi or anything, or like any piece of technology that I think might have advantages or even like a process. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I was going to go off on that tangent and I forgot. Um, but I think it's a good question. I don't think what I was going to say is consulting. I don't really think is different from being a contributor or being a not consultant because being a consultant is really just influencing people. I think the difference as a consultant is that you kind of have a bit of a free pass because as a consultant, you're automatically like a neutral political party in the company. And it's kind of sad to say how much impact that has, but like just coming if you're an employee at the company and on a team, like it's automatically assumed you have some bias there, like you're invested from a certain viewpoint. And as a consultant, that may not necessarily be the case. Number one. And number two, there's a fair chance you got hired by like a C level or a VP level person, and that automatically gives you more sway. Like, just the way it is.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily that different. It's just like the circumstances of a consultant are different. But in general, I would say if you want to influence, the principles are the same. And influencing upper level management, the only thing I've found that really works is numbers. Like, they deal with too many teams to get into specifics of anything. They want numbers. They go crazy over numbers. So if you can show, if I'm a dev, for instance, or if I'm a project manager or something, here's how many hours we spend a week trying to push stuff out manually. Or here's how many hours we spend waiting a week on the other team to push our stuff out. Here's how much money you pay our engineers. So here's how much money we're spending just doing nothing right now. That matters more than like, hey, this kind of sucks and I know a better way to do it. Like, and if you can present them this alternative, like if we just start small on a, you know, $10,000 experiment or whatever it is, and here's how I think it'll work out. Here's a little bit of evidence like that. That speaks way more than what sometimes comes across as like, here's a new tool I want to play with as a dev, right?
Mm. So that's like an anti-pattern. It's like, hey, here's this new tool, and I think it's awesome. Like that's not the right way.
I think maybe that's like, I don't know if devs do that a lot, but I think that's the impression people get a lot. It's like, oh, this is a technical person. Obviously, that's what they care about. They want to do technical things. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. What? So that's like that feels like a common point of persistence, right? If you're like, hey, here's this new tool, and I think it's cool. Like they've heard that story before, so that's not the way to approach it. What other resistance to change, do you tend to encounter? Any specifics,
Um,
examples come up a lot, or
yeah. So, specifically with infrastructure as code, or just kind of speaking in general, I guess.
either or? You can take it however you'd like.
Yeah. I would say with both, I'm kind of thinking a little infrastructure as code, but also with other things, there is a tendency to standardize on stuff, which in general I think is good because it removes work from teams. But you can definitely go too far in the other direction to where, like, you're reviewing every single thing a team does and it has to go through all these hoops and then all these roadblocks to like even push anything out to production when you can automate all this stuff really. And it's probably, I think that comes from companies being bitten before and losing a lot of money from like not having checks and roadblocks in place. And then it's hard to see the forest from the trees. Like it's hard to see that they're still losing a lot of money because they're making it take so long for people to push stuff out. Um, but they're not getting bitten in the same way, right? So then maybe they don't notice. Um,
So is that like
yeah.
maybe you could give a specific made up example of that? Like,
Yeah.
is it like I want to create an S3 bucket, but I can't because there's this procedure and a review board or I don't know.
Yeah. So a couple things come to mind. One is like a change control board or a cab or whatever you call them. And it's like we have to manually review every single thing that goes out to prod, right? When instead you can have, I know Palumi has policy as code. I forget what they call the thing for Palumi now.
Crossguard, yeah.
CrossGuard. Yep. Um, and CloudFormation has Chekhov rules, I think. But like, there's ways to automate this stuff that ensure teams are staying like within these guardrails, basically, but they're free to act as they want within the guardrails. And I think SOC 2 compliance is part of it, and maybe places just don't realize you can automate all the checks that are in SOC 2. And I've also seen it like with pipelines, like I'm sure we're going to talk about in this as well with GitHub Actions just being like becoming massive because they want to ensure all this stuff is staying like kosher, right? Or I've also seen manual, like before you're allowed to do stuff in your cloud accounts, these massive, several week long security compliance things.
Mm,
So,
nice.
yeah.
No, makes sense. Is there other change, organizational change stuff that you think we should mention? Any tips to share or?
There's something that I guess comes to mind talking about this stuff. that I did not invent. I think it has. I'm going to look it up so I don't mess up the word. Okay,
Yeah.
Nemawashi. So I learned this from one of the co-founders of the company I'm at, but it's it's a Japanese thing. Like I just looked it up. It's even got its own Wikipedia article. But it's basically like before you introduce an idea. So let's say like I want to go to this someone on the team or like the manager or something with an idea. Before I do that, I individually go to every person on the team first and get their thoughts on it. And then like this is something I probably feel pretty good about. So this if all the people on the team are like, oh yeah, that sounds great, or like maybe there was one exception or something, then I can go to the person I actually want to go to and say, hey, everybody on the team wants this thing. Like, what do you think about it? And even though I've only talked to everybody one on one, like I've got a lot more. There's a lot more weight behind that suggestion. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that's probably applicable to some of your questions.
Now, would
Yeah.
you adjust that based on things that people said, or is it just getting the
Yeah,
check mark, or
absolutely.
is it getting feedback?
Absolutely. Getting feedback. Yeah. Yeah. It means turning the roots, I guess, like doing kind of the same concept of like doing things a little bit at a time, right? Instead of like all trying to do it all at once, but maybe from a people influencing perspective. Um, yeah. I guess it could sound a little manipulative if you're going from the viewpoint of I'm doing this because I want this thing instead of trying to figure out what's best for the team. But yeah, if you get pushed, like if you're getting pushback from every single person you ask, maybe it's not as great of an idea you thought it was. um, but if pretty much everyone agrees with it, then you've got a lot of ammo now. Like either way,
Nice,
you learn something from it, right?
nice. And what was your viral adoption approach?
Sorry, say that again.
I wrote this down when we talked earlier. You said it's best if your change is viral.
Oh, viral. Yeah. So this is kind of how we try or prefer to work with teams, I guess. So basically, kind of goes to the push pull thing I talked about earlier. It's usually way better to work, if you can, way better to work with teams that ask for your help instead of like getting pushed on a team and saying you are going to receive help. This is kind of related. So rather than trying to influence everybody, especially the people who don't want it, people are usually way less resistant and way more accepting of thing. Like if you can show them you're making their life easier, they're way more likely or making their job easier to accept your help. So when we say like sometimes on our teams we say like we try to make it go viral. So we work with one team who wants our help, just make them like really good because they want to adopt this stuff and then like make them really effective. So the idea is other teams then like notice that team, like how come they're doing so well? Like how are they releasing this many times a week? How do they have such a small amount of defects? How's their pipeline so fast? Whatever. So instead, they're just like, how can we get like that now? Right. So through that, they either maybe also ask for our help or just like look at that team's repo and try to mimic what they're doing. Either way, like I'm happy that, you know, stuff's improving. So that like viral adoption, quote unquote, is more about like we did such a good job over here that other places are convinced just by seeing the results. And that means you did a good job too, right, as a consultant.
That's awesome. So I want to shift to talk specifically about infrastructure as code. How does it fit
Yeah.
in the type of work you do? Like when when are you asking for changes to that? When is there resistance to it, etc.?
So in general, I think infrastructure as code, like not everywhere, right? But in general, I think IAC is a lot more table stakes these days. Like a lot of companies have it already, and they just maybe aren't doing it well. But it's not nearly as uncommon as it used to be. Like they might be using something besides Palumi. I think it is hard to have actual continuous delivery without IAC. Because if you don't have IAC, that means your developers can't define their own infrastructure. And that means they have to wait on another team to do it. And if they have to wait on another team to do it, then it's not continuous, right? by continuous, I want teams to be able to deploy every 30 minutes if they want. And if I have to wait 2 days, like 1 to 3 business days, I don't know, on the operations team to create my stuff, it's not going to happen.
And what resistance do you see, or do you see resistance when you're saying like, hey, the developer team actually needs to be able to provision infrastructure hands off? Or
I think two main things come to mind with that. One, so you have DevOps, right? So one is from the dev side, one's from the ops side. The devs are like, I already have my plate full. I got to learn this other stuff, right? I have to learn cloud and how to deploy it on top of that. And on the ops side, like that's their job, right? So they don't want to lose their job. So those are both pretty fair, I think. So, and actually, I think my first blog post on Palumi and IAC kind of went into this, but the reality is it's kind of a win-win for both sides. So the ops side, it's like you don't lose your job. It just kind of like shifts a little bit. Instead of doing these tasks that are like, if you're in AWS, like create a Lambda for me, create a queue for me. So I've never been on the operations team. I just imagine that's not a very engaging task. And then like, here's my code bundle. Replace the old code bundle with this one. Like, and then if something goes wrong, you'd have to IM them. It just seems annoying to me. You'd probably rather be working on more creative stuff. And
yeah,
that's kind of what you shift into. Like these mundane things are kind of now the responsibilities of the dev and they're automated, but like just within their little space of their apps, right? And then ops a lot of times moves into something like, what's called platform teams, where you look for like common things that are solved over and over across the whole org and create common solutions for those. Or you manage company-wide stuff like Splunk or Dynatrace, stuff like that, like stuff that affects all the teams that is actually a little more creative and you can create new features and stuff for. And on the dev side, your job sucks less because like the corollary is like you don't have to wait on the ops team, right? You're like, well, my work is blocked, my ticket's blocked for 2 days because I need my queue. You don't have to do that. You just deploy when you want. So as a dev, I didn't mind learning the new stuff. That was way better to me.
yeah. Now, yeah, you mentioned platform engineering. It feels like that's a big trend that's like people are starting to understand. Like, oh yeah, we could elevate the problem. Move from doing specific tasks to maybe building some sort of components people could use. I mean, do you find that to be the case too, or how early are we, or how late are we in this platform world?
Just like as an industry, kind of. I don't know. I'd say platform engineering probably, I'm just guessing, as a concept, has been around for like a decade now or so. But I mean, I feel like every time I learn about a new idea in programming, I'm like, oh my gosh, this sounds awesome. It's from like the 80s or something, and people just never, like, people just never took off with it. I'm like, what? Like, how come I'm just hearing about this now? But I'm definitely a believer in platform teams. I think they're great. Um, like, it just seems a little wasteful if every single team has to manage their own side of the Splunk instance, for instance, or like I guess Dynatrace, to use that example again. Like it's going to be the logging solution. It doesn't matter what kind of app you're making. Every team's going to need that. So instead of having every team reinvent the wheel on that and figure it out, that's something that's like it's kind of a solved problem, logging, right? There's not going to be
Yeah.
a whole bunch of new stuff coming out for this, but a platform team can kind of specifically fit to the needs of the org, like how the logging exactly works, how teams find their logs, stuff like that. And as the platform team, they kind of look at all the teams in the org and see the things that can be standardized. And I think that's very helpful. I think you get for common tools, that's very helpful. You get a better top down view. Instead of like enforcing stuff that makes it take longer for teams, you end up removing a problem from the team and solving it for them, kind of. And on top of that, especially with Palumi, like you can create these like common patterns with component resources and stuff that you see teams using a lot. Like, oh, like Very common for teams to create a Lambda-backed API gateway. So here's one for that, or a Lambda hooked up to an SQS queue. Like these are super common things. Here's it out of the box. Like here's a little component resource for that, so you don't have to write it yourself. So that's a little more engaging, probably, than the problems I was talking about earlier. And you get to help a bunch of people at once. So I think that's awesome.
I think I really love the statement about like instead of enforcing some sort of rules, you're like, oh, you're building something that people can use. Like it just it gives it a better. It's much easier to spread virally, to use your term. If you're like, oh, you don't have to do this. It's just I built this thing that does the lambda and the networking for it and whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and for teams, it's like, got to figure out the logging again for this app. Or instead, it's way nicer if you can just have, well, here's the endpoint, you're good to go. Like, that's awesome.
Nice.
Yeah, so that came from, I did a presentation recently. In C Sharp, there's a tool called Nuke Build, and it lets you basically write your pipeline, like GitHub Action or Azure Pipelines. It lets you write that in C Sharp instead of YAML. So you still have a GitHub Action, but it'll have like one step in it, and it just calls your C Sharp actual pipeline. And I was like, oh my gosh, I wish for something like this for forever. I just didn't know about it. And that kind of came from like you said, I had a GitHub action that was basically the example I said. It was like 1,000 line, and it calls a shared action, which calls a shared action, and it's just like super hard to actually figure out what is going on with this thing. I can't use breakpoints, right? I can't use like the normal libraries I would. Um, and I think the big file you're talking about was an example I used in that presentation, where it's something with Prometheus and Kubernetes, and it's an auto-generated file, just to be fair. But I think it's 69,000 lines or something of YAML. So my example is like somewhere between my ESLint and this. All I'm saying is that maybe like somewhere between there, we should stop using YAML. So I have not seen a human-made 69,000 line YAML, but like I said, I've seen 1,000 lines, which calls out to several other files, which are hundreds of lines. As that's too much for me. Oh.
That's awesome. I feel like so it has something to do with abstraction, I think, in my mind, where it's like, um if you're using an imperative programming language, if you can have loops or ifs and things, then you're able to, just remove repetitive things into like function calls or whatever. And you just have that ability to build up larger structures or build up components, even if you're talking at that level. But sometimes when we talk about config code getting really large, I think that is the root of it, is that like, oh, we don't have a way to abstract away this chunk. Like maybe we have modules, but they're kind of messy or something. And so it ends up copy and pasting a lot. And then it kind of grows out of control. Like, I don't know, what do you think of that?
Yeah, totally agreed. And you end up using a lot of magic strings with imperative or declarative. I think I mixed those up earlier. You end up using a lot of magic strings, so like it's easy to forget one when you change the values of stuff, right? Instead of just like refactor rename. And not only that, it's the tooling. Like I use programming languages. I'm familiar with the tooling for like IDEs and all the normal packages and libraries and stuff I can use. And that stuff is kind of there for YAML, but it's just not nearly the same level, right? Like they're not nearly as mature. They don't do as much. YAML just can't do as much, right? And kind of the rub with, I think, with YAML and like part of the reason Terraform is so popular is that non-devs can use it, right? I don't
Yeah.
need to be a dev. I can be on the platform team or something as someone who's not a dev and still help these teams by creating, component resources or whatever. And the nice thing with Palumi is you can do both. Like you can write it in YAML and put it out there, and then even transform it to C Sharp or TypeScript or whatever teams are using from that YAML you wrote, or vice versa. So I think Palumi is kind of the best of all the worlds there. Like even if you're not just purely .NET shop, for an example, you're like some teams are using C Sharp, some are using Java, some are using Python. Like you can still have Palumi work there. You just do it Like you can write it in YAML and then export it to the other languages for the component resource, and it just kind of works, right? I think that's one of the reasons that Palumi is awesome.
Sell me on Palumi.
Yeah, so I'm going to assume this person is already sold on IAC. So Palumi specifically. All right, so kind of your options are, it depends on the cloud you're using, right? But you might have AWS CDK, which is pretty close to Palumi. And then you have Terraform, right? Probably everyone's going to examine Terraform as an option. And then Palumi. So I'm going to say those are your big players for this case. So AWS CDK and Palumi, pretty close in what they offer. So like CDK is also, you can write in imperative languages like C# or something, right? The difference, I think the major difference there is that AWS CDK under the hood uses CloudFormation. So that's just a black box. It's proprietary. The CDK libraries themselves are open source, but CloudFormation just kind of nobody knows how it works. So if something goes wrong, you kind of just have to like poke around, hope there's a GitHub issue that someone had asked already, right? And when your deployments take a long time, like 20 plus 15 to 30 minutes, there's not much you can do, right? It's just how CloudFormation is working, and you just kind of deal with it. Whereas Palumi, it's the engine, like everything's open source. It's just making API calls. So like if you can't speed that up, then like there's really nothing you can do. And then compared to Terraform, like you said, it's HCL. It's like this YAML like, but it's declarative, right? So that's fine in some cases. There's nothing wrong with declarative. Kind of just what I said before about at a certain point, I think that starts to break down. Like when you start having these real big systems and you have these big chunks of resources that you want to share between teams, it kind of becomes more cumbersome than helpful at that point, in my opinion. And that's why Terraform is working on their own CDK right now. And you kind of get, even if you want to use YAML, you have like, wow, we've got some platform teams who aren't devs, and we want them to be able to set standards and write these resources. You can still do that with Palumi. You can use YAML with Palumi and then transform those component resources they've written into other imperative languages for dev teams to use. So,
That's awesome.
okay,
Yeah.
there's my pitch.
I'm sold. All right.
Hope I get a
What's that?
hope I get a honorarium on that or something.
There you go. All right. I think we covered all the interesting questions. What do you think? Or is there anything else you want to throw out there?
I think I pretty much got it. I'll shout out that I'm writing a blog series right now on Palumi, about to pretty new, about to post the second post on it on my blog, which is daninacan.com. I'm not selling anything on there. I just have a mostly .NET technical blog. So if that's your thing, go check it out. I also do speaking at conferences every now and then, so you can find my speaking page on there if you want me to speak for something. Then I can do that too. Again, not selling anything. I don't think I've ever gotten paid for it, but yeah, do consulting for lean techniques and solo on the side as well. Oh.
That's awesome. I'll put a link in the description to your blog post. Yeah. So
Well, appreciate it.
yeah. I think that's a wrap. I hope if you're watching this, you've picked up some valuable insights about introducing change in your organization. And yeah, especially when that is infrastructure as code. If you found Dan's advice useful or helpful, please give this video a thumbs up or leave a comment with more questions. Maybe Dan will respond. And I'll put a link to his blog. Yeah, so what challenges have you faced with infrastructure? Would any of these tips be helpful? Let us know below. We'll continue the conversation. But yeah, thanks, Dan, for being here.